All right, welcome to this lesson on solving equations with exponents. This is a continuation of our solving equations. And so we were doing equations with, with brackets last. So now we're going to look at ones with exponents. Now, what this means is something is being squared in this. We're not going to use cubes, just squares. So just to be safe. And we will notice that there are a couple different things that are different here. One, we don't rush to get rid of brackets. We're going to use our square root to get rid of our brackets when things are being squared in a bracket. So that's an important factor or important feature, I should say, of solving these. So I'm going to do some examples and we'll work our way through it. So one of the things we do to get rid of the square is to square root things. So I'll turn on my pen here. And we'll move ahead, and what we'll do is we'll square root both sides of this equation. And in doing so, what we end up with is the square root of x squared is simply x. That's the beauty or power of doing that. It gets rid of my x squared. And the square root of 25 is 5. Now, if you use your calculator, you get that. What most kids don't realize is there is a second answer, and it's not just 5, but the second answer is also minus 5. And that's because minus 5 times minus 5 will also give you 25. And so we write the answer like this, plus or minus. Another way we could write it is x equals 5 comma minus 5, and that represents the two answers that it can be. It must be separated by a comma. That's really crucial, okay? So those are both the basic or most simplistic kind of questions where we give you x squared equals a number, and usually, almost always, we're going to give you a number here that is a perfect square. In other words, you can find the square root of it. If you don't know your square roots, you can look them up and use your calculator. I often encourage kids to memorize the first few square roots. So 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, and of course 100. That's up to 10. Those are the square roots, okay? That's up to you. You can use your calculator to do that. We're going to move on and do the next question, which adds a little bit of complexity here. And that is we've now added a bracket component here. So the same basic rule applies. As long as everything is being squared here, which it is, x minus 1 is entirely being squared, we can take the square root of it. So I'm going to take my square root, draw it, and I often put a little line under when it's a long thing. I don't do it usually when it's just a number, but if it's a long thing, I will draw that line down just to indicate I'm taking the square root of everything, not just the x, but the whole thing. And again, that leaves me with simply x minus 1. And it's because all of it is being squared, I can take the square root of that, okay? Then it will equal 4. And again, it's plus or minus 4. Now this creates a little bit of a different dilemma because we're not just into an answer here. It's not just x minus 1 equals plus or minus 4, that we don't have an answer. What is x? So we have to write this in two ways. We write it as x minus 1 equals 4, or x minus 1 equals minus 4. And essentially we have two different equations that we're going to solve. One is over here and one is over here. So x minus 1 equals 4 we can solve by adding 1 to both sides. And we get an answer of x equals 5. And then we write or. It's important that you write or because you're saying that it's not all one statement here. We're actually writing two sets of statements, and that allows us to have two equal signs in one row of work, which is normally very taboo. It's something that we just don't do, right? So this here, plus 1 on both sides. Again, this becomes 0, and I'm left with x equals, in this case, minus 4 plus 1 is minus 3. And I have two answers. I can now write those two answers in this format where I write x equals 5 comma minus 3. If you skip this step here, where I'm going to box this step, if you skip this step, it wouldn't be crucial, but you do have the correct answers indicated here. But this is just sort of like the formal way mathematicians like to write these things. Okay, so let's move down and try another question that adds one more step. Okay, so I'm just increasing the level of steps each time we go. All right. In this particular case, I now have a +5 in association with the component that's being squared. So x plus 3 is being squared, but I also have +5. And I would prefer to get rid of the +5. In fact, I don't prefer. I have to if I want to take the square root, because I can't take the square root of something that's not squared and get the answer of being just x plus 3. I'd have to deal with how this would square root, and makes it more complicated. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to subtract 5 from both sides of the equation. And this allows me to isolate my squared component. So this leaves me with x plus 3 in brackets squared equals 41 minus 5, which I believe is 36. Okay, now this is now ready to be square rooted because all of it is being squared. And then I can square root this side as well. And the way I've designed most of these questions is that whenever you're going to square root both sides, both sides will result in a perfect square. So this ends up with x plus 3 equals the square root of 36. And if you use your calculator, if you don't know the answer is 6. But because also minus 6 would multiply square to give me 36, I write it as plus or minus. I add that little plus or minus. And this now must be broken into two possible equations. One will be x plus 3 equals 6, and the other, or x plus 3 equals minus 6. And we're going to solve these two equations now. I'm just going to erase that. Sorry, my palm caused that. So now I'm going to solve both of these two equations that I have. First, I'll do this one, and then I'll go over and do this one. So the answer here will be minus 3 and minus 3, and that will leave me with x equals 3. Or I can subtract 3 here and subtract 3 here, and x will equal minus 9. As minus 6, take away another 3 will be minus 9. And so those are my two possible answers. How do I write that? I write x equals 3 comma minus 9, and I can draw a box around that just to sort of solidify there's my answer for that question. Very nicely done. Okay, let's add one more level of complexity to this, by which we put a 2 out in front of the bracket. So we just add one more component of complexity. In this case, we also have the minus 53 here, which creates a rather interesting dynamic as well. So the first thing I want to do is I want to isolate this part. I want to get rid of the minus 53, just like we did the last time. So I'm going to add 53 to both sides. And that is going to give me a whopping 98 over here, I believe. And on this side, I'm still left with 2 bracket x plus 5 squared. Now, I need to isolate my x plus 5 all by itself. And in order to do that, what I need to do is divide both sides by 2, because this is multiplying here. So the opposite of multiplying is going to be dividing. So I'm going to divide by 2. That's going to cross off and give me 1. And here I'm going to divide by 2. And I'm going to end up with x plus 5 squared equals 49. All right. Now I'm in a situation where I can finally have the x plus 5 all by itself. And so I can take the square root of this. So if I move my pen in here, write it like this, square root here, and this will leave me with x plus 5 equals plus or minus 7. and I'm getting close because now I can write this as x plus 5 equals 7, or x plus 5 equals minus 7. And I can solve each of these. Subtract 5 from this side, subtract 5. That gives me x equals 2, or x equals, well, minus 5 minus 5. Minus 7 minus 5 will be actually minus 12. And if I wanted to write the answer, I'm going to do it over here on the side. I'd write x equals 2, comma, minus 12. And there is my whopping wonderful answer for that question. There's a worksheet for you to work on. Of course, the answer keys are available. There's a quiz if you really want to do it. So there's lots of things you can practice your skills to improve. This is solving equations with exponents. We are going to solve equations with more complicated exponents, known as you have seen in the past, trinomials and factoring trinomials, in our next lesson.